everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Bookish, a casual book club. I'm Laura Yu. I'm here with my friends Sylvia Lee and Kofi Adisa.
Hey.
Hey. Today we are going to be talking about a book called Imagination, a Manifesto by Dr. Ruha Benjamin. And before we start the discussion, I want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Benjamin, and it's from her own bio from her website. She writes, I am Alexander Stewart, 1886 professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and founding director of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab. As a transdisciplinary scholar, writer, and educator, I take a critical and creative approach to investigating the social dimensions of science, technology, and medicine. Taken together, her body of work addresses debates about how science and technology shape the social world and how people can, should, and do critically and creatively engage technoscience, grappling all the while with the fact that what may bring health and longevity to some may threaten the dignity and rights of others. When it all boils down, the tension between innovation and equity is mainly what keeps me up at night. So I wanted to share that, in her own words, her bio, because I think it's a good summary or perspective of the framework of how to frame the topic of discussion today with this book. So I'm going to actually start with Kofi. Kofi recommended this book to us, and what'd you think?
I recommended it because I was reading it for another purpose and trying to incorporate this idea of what it means to imagine things in a real space, but differently, right? And so for me, it was about the classroom and about teaching and learning. That's not necessarily what the book is about. I think the book poses some questions about why it is challenging for us to imagine and how our imaginations have been almost co-opted and almost commercialized in a way, either through neo-capitalist technologies or just within the sort of ether of capitalism that we all are experiencing. And I think that because of that and how she sort of gives a brief history, because it's a fairly thin book, and then how she tries to provide, I shouldn't say tries to, she does provide some ways we can think through how we understand each other and how we understand our communities. And definitely in terms of classrooms or even in book clubs, she has an appendix at the end that sort of hints at ways we can think about these things, or at least try to imagine differently what the possibilities are for not just classrooms, but in society and as sort of a collective way of thinking about each other, because so much of capitalism is individualistic. But she really hones in on eugenics as an anchoring theory or an anchoring discipline, or maybe even an anchoring action in which it almost always privileges a superiority over another and tries to rationalize that in a way that is, it's kind of like a social construct. If you remember our last episode when we were talking about S.A. Cosby, there was this discussion about how there's a critique with these social constructs. And I think she's making a more blatant critique as opposed to one maybe more figurative or metaphorical. I think she's really honing in on why we have to use our imagination. And she starts off by talking about when she was in I guess it would be gifted and talented, and how she was able to play and use her imagination, and others in her class weren't allowed to do that or did not have access to do that. And because of that, she was able to basically flourish because she had an opportunity to play and imagine and wonder. And that is something for me, as I was, reading this and thinking about this address that I'm going to have in March, that it's something to think about. And when it comes to teaching and learning, we often say we want to do things differently, but in our own little classrooms, and I don't mean little as in minute, but in that space within a college or a university, that's usually just one space. And I think what she's talking about is a collective space and a collective action that we can all participate in and change. But it is not an easy change, because not everyone wants to change, because there's some benefits within this eugenics ideology that even Black and brown people who find themselves in those positions reinforce and reproduce. There was a speech that she gave, I guess it was during Spelsman's commencement, where she was talking about sisterhood and also relaying that to the police, I guess, commissioner in Atlanta. And she said, Black faces in high places will not save you. And I think that is something to keep in mind, that it's not really a black and white issue for her. It's really about a human experience. But because of, I guess, this sort of ideological way of thinking about superiority and who has power and who cannot have power, it falls on the lines of black and white or race or ethnicity in some of these social constructs. So it is a really, really interesting book. I found myself taking a lot of notes, but it's different from your average novel. And so this is one of our, I don't know, this year's, I guess this season, this is our first nonfiction work.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So Sylvia, your thoughts. I know I prattled on.
No, great prattling. So for listeners out there, if you're thinking it's an interesting title, Imagination, a Manifesto. Yeah, I remember in undergrad, I took a class, and the entire class was themed for manifesto. So we read a bunch of them, including like Communist Manifesto. Like, we read a bunch of manifestos to understand functionally what it is a manifesto is designed to do, and the short of it, if anybody out there is familiar, or if you've read a manifesto, and you'll notice like a lot of people who commit some interesting crimes, they'll like have this kind of scree that they'll find. Police will often find it, like a manifesto, like a bomber's manifesto, like that kind of a thing. And it is a practice, a form, if you will, a genre, right, of writing in which you're putting down like mission, right, and principles, the guiding principles for how one ought to act, right, and what should inform our actions. And so when Kofi, you recommended this book, I was like, interesting, a manifesto about the imagination and the role that the imagination plays. And what I really appreciated about the book is that Ruha Benjamin sets us up first with like this idea that we are living out in our everyday lives other people's imaginations every day, right? And so if you use a smartphone, if you engage in AI, which she talks a lot about, if you anything that we're engaging with, that's somebody's imagination that we're under. The educational system, the whole field of statistics, right, is a product essentially of imagination. And so the challenge and the call is that Ruha Benjamin puts out there, which I really appreciated, was to not let that imagination be dominated and taken over mindlessly by other people's desires to shape the world. And in particular, she calls out the technocrats, right? These tech giants whose imaginations are bending. I think she quotes a virtual reality tech guy, John Carmack, as like bending the world to our will using virtual reality. And she's like, whose will and whose world, and the opening pages of the chapter she has on imagining eugenics, which I was very surprised to see that in this book, because, if you're familiar with eugenics, which Kofi just talked about, it's discouraging reproduction from unsavory or people you don't want to reproduce and encourage you reproduce. But the way that she weaves that in, I thought was so fascinating. And she starts that section off with a quote by the guy who created all this virtual reality. And he's basically talking about how, not everyone can have a mansion or a home theater, right? But these things you can simulate in virtual reality, So most of the people in the real world live in like cramped quarters. They don't have, what they would choose to have if they had unlimited resources. And then she asks a very succinct question right after that. But how about a reality where everyone has sufficient resources? Yeah. You haven't imagined that. For the ultra wealthy, it is either or, and this is what they're selling us on, And I think what she's calling people to do is to like snap out of it, and he talks about how, like, in Texas, where he's from, it's 100 degrees outside, right? But they have air conditioning everywhere, so they can bend the world to their will and live in a reality that they want. And she's like, meanwhile, she was reading that during that cold snap that killed a lot of underprivileged people. And then that's when I started to make the link between, I see what she's doing with this idea of eugenics. Same with, like, standardized testing in schools, right? Basing assessments off antiquated measurement tools that everybody has acknowledged is rife with bias and problems, in which she goes deeper into the history of statistics and the bias that brings as well. And yet, we're just kind of like, okay, we still use it. We still do it because we're hard pressed to imagine something different, right? But what happens with that is it impacts negatively the lives of the poor, the lives of the under-resourced, right? Often who are marginalized, and it continues. And so their quality of life diminishes. And as that happens, what happens to that group, right? Eugenics. And that's how she brings in incarceration. So it's a very dense thing, but all that to say, as I was reading it, I couldn't help but look at the world around me in this lens. And where we live and work in Columbia, Maryland, this was an imagined community, right? Created by Jim Rouse and the Rouse Foundation, in which he imagined a certain type of community and how people would live. And it was really interesting then to start reading the world around me in that lens. And for Rouse, it was a integrated community where different races and ethnicities would live, commingled, which was different back then when redlining and segregation and unfair housing practices were just kind of a normal thing. And then, he had this vision of, like, mixing socioeconomic groups together in one neighborhood. And if you think about it now, it's kind of like a radical thing that he was imagining, and what has happened, in the years since, right? So I thought it was really, like, I couldn't help but start to read everything around me according to her manifesto. Like, I was telling Laura that I went to go see the South Korean film No Other Choice, which has been, like, nominated for a bunch of different awards. And it is a kind of like an indictment on late stage capitalism and what happens. But even then, as I was watching, I was thinking about some of her ideas about the main character who turns to extreme measures when he's fired from his job at a paper factory after 25 years. And he's trying desperately to get back into that kind of a job. Meanwhile, all around him, there's reminders of a different type of future that could happen if his imagination were not so tightly wound to the capitalist promises that he is clinging on to. And I don't think I would have watched it in the same way without her manifesto. So I just thought it was a really interesting book that I think is asking people to just, wake up and imagine a different future. Yeah. But it's so hard to actually do in the systems that we're in. Anyways, speaking of prattling, that is my prattle. Laura?
I saw the movie too, same weekend. We didn't go together, but No Other Choice. And actually, it was interesting. My husband and I talked about the translation of that phrase, no other choice. And not only the main character, but throughout the film, other characters also say it. As in, it couldn't be helped or it can't be helped. And you're right, in the context of this book, it is a failure of imagination that they feel choiceless, right? That this is the only thing I can do to remedy the situation. But, I come away thinking, like, I don't know, maybe the translation would have been, better translation would have been, it couldn't be helped. The way they say it in Korean in the film.
The character uses his imagination, which tells me he has one.
In evil
ways, which I'm like, you use all that imagination for that? Yeah. Like, meanwhile, you're like a very talented bonsai grower, or something.
But, that's actually, I'm glad you said that, because for me, the big takeaway was kind of actually, I felt kind of stupid after realizing it or thinking about it. Was like, why didn't I know that? I think generally the word imagination is often associated with goodness, right? Yes. Like and creativity and progress. And the book reminded me, oh my gosh, the evildoers can do the evil because they imagined it, right? The eugenicists of the 20th century worked on it because they could imagine a world where only superior human beings existed, right? And I think one of the things I read was that one of the
statisticians,
was there are actually three main ones who were strong eugenicists, and their names were Ronald Fisher, and Galton and Pearson, and we know Pearson, right? And Sylvia and I recently took a statistics class last year. So thinking about these developments in statistics and how they were linked to this idea of studying human behavior and humans to establish the norm. And a lot of these statistical measurements or standards were actually developed at the same time by these three people who were proponents of eugenics. And so that's where the eugenics and the statistics comes from, apparently. But a reminder about like the power of imagination is it's not power neutral, right? Like it can go in the wrong way by my standards, right? Or it can be used for good. And her examples about why don't we imagine a world where there is no poverty? Or why can't we imagine a world where everyone has access to healthcare, can go to a doctor? Why can't we imagine that? If we can imagine a world where we don't have to be hot in 105 degree weather, right? And so this idea that if we can imagine it and can make it happen, I mean, not easily, but through hard work, obviously, but with commitment, political will, and resources, obviously, but it's the imagination that drives the action. So it was kind of like a light bulb moment for me about the power of imagination to bring about bad. And I wonder if in some ways that I had not thought about, I thought of injustices or unjust situation as just unfortunate byproduct of something, right? That of course it's not. Of course it was driven by somebody's idea and somebody's resources and somebody's hard work at it to make it happen. But I wonder if like I look at those injustices as like, oh, that really is terrible. Oh, that sucks, right? Like, how did we get here? As if we don't really know, except we do, right? And they happen because of these choices that we made, or some people made, or collectively made, that those bad things or unjust situations are happening. And I consider myself a pretty progressive and open-minded and educated person, and still assume those things to be just unfortunate things that just can't be helped. Like how could we ever have a world where everybody is healthy? Well, why can't we, right? And then thinking about imagination only with positive things, I think that was like a really interesting wake-up call for me.
The example she gives is Richard Williams and Oracene Price and how they imagine Serena and Venus Williams, especially Richard Williams. And they were under his imagination because they were his kids. And he envisioned, and I'm saying envision, not imagine, but he envisioned the possibilities for his daughters. And I think as a parent, I think we do the same thing. We sort of imagine the best for our children, but I think it's couched within the framework of our imaginations. We want to see and envision and believe and think of our children being able to do all kinds of things, while at the same time recognizing that what we're imagining is predicated on the realities that our kids experience, right? And so had Venus and Serena not been successful, what would that have meant for how Richard Williams imagined them? But I think what Benjamin is trying to show is that it's not just simply, my kids, I hope my kids do well in school. It's really instilling in them the belief that they will do well in school, that they can see themselves at the U.S. Open winning, and they can see themselves in Wimbledon. That type of power, and it takes a concerted effort. It takes dealing with the reality and seeing beyond that reality in a different way. But it is hard because it's not a collective thing. It is an individual thing. And I think when you look at sports figures or parents and who have major sports success in their children, like Derek Jeter, for instance, his father was a baseball player, right? But he wasn't Derek Jeter. He's the father of Derek Jeter. And, it's that level of commitment and belief and what you're pouring into people. And I think that is one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of teaching and learning. And when you're working with students, a lot of times professors are trying to either pontificate or pour into the students something that we imagine they need, we imagine they want, we imagine that would benefit them after they leave our classrooms or after they leave the college or university. But there's a reality that we have to contend with and we have to experience with students as well, because they're experiencing it too. They don't know our imagination. All they hear is, this is what you got to do. They don't know that, no, this is part of a bigger framework in which we see the world in which you will be an active member.
Right.
And for, I think, a lot of students, depending on where they come from and depending on their socialization, they may feel conditioned to see that as an anathema to the reality that they're leading or going to, because they imagine themselves in a different way. And this class that they're taking or these courses that they're taking either confirm, reaffirm, or support that imagination. And if it's anything that they see as inconsequential or mundane to that, they are easily able to dismiss. That's one of the complexities of this book, that everything that she is saying, why can't we do that? There is an answer.
There is, for sure.
Because it's hard.
And, she mentions that too when she's, and I'm looking at some of my notes, where she's talking about these systems that we find ourselves in that can make it feel impossible. So what if I can imagine a future? I can't do anything about it because these systems are so entrenched. What can I do? And she says basically on page 64, imagination, we might say, is the invisible circuitry that connects the world out there to our inner world. So we cannot just be critical of oppressive systems without also examining how our own private thoughts and desires reflect and reproduce a dominant imagination that values some lives over others. We must, in a sense, continuously deprogram ourselves, challenging the hierarchies that place us above or below, and decode the imaginative justifications that make those hierarchies seem natural, durable, and deserved. And I think that's a real challenge. And for young people who, we work with, and even for ourselves, but especially when you're in college and you're, learning new things, depending on the class you're going to, you're absolutely right. It can either reinforce or help to sort of break into a larger imagination that the student can see for themselves. And in fact, some of the returning students, I would argue, are trying to see that more because they're imagining something else, right, than what they have already done. It's kind of like, I think she says, like, we need to leave, but what do we need to leave behind in order to travel somewhere new? And I think her statements are really powerful in that sense, because it is about doing this sort of internal work as much as it is about dismantling a system. Like, who can do that, if you're from a marginalized community? However, I will say, I've been watching the new New York City mayor with great interest, because I see these ideas playing out in the way he has relentlessly pursued what could have been a very unpopular set of ideas. What I think was selling young people in New York City especially was his imagination of what the city should be and could be for people. And I think that was really appealing. And so I see him trying to, I see a lot of her ideas kind of, coming into that. Why does it have to be this way? Why can't we do universal childcare for all 2-year-olds? Okay, day 8, I'm going to make it happen. It's crazy. But, at the same time, I'm sitting here kind of skeptical. We'll see. We'll see how long it takes for you to bend to the, social art. But that's me butting up against what I think is just kind of natural and impossible to change.
It makes me think about William Blake's innocence and experience. In that I think experience is sometimes the enemy of imagination. And I'm thinking of, for instance, like Kofi, when you're talking about students, when students come into the classroom, and I've been teaching for 20 years, I think I know these students. To some extent, of course, I have to bring my experiential knowledge. And that's partly statistics, right? Oh, in my 20 years of students and how many ever hundreds or thousands of students I've had, that's my data, right? And in my head, very quickly, I'm sure I'm making judgment calls, right?
Absolutely.
About who's going to be successful, who's going to behave this way. And of course, we cannot not rely on that experience and data and what we know, the prior knowledge. But that is what sometimes blocks my ability to imagine a different world, a different situation. And so I've noticed, like, same thing with you about the New York mayor. I think one of the proposals he'd had was like free transportation or something, free buses or something like that. And all I see on social media are people going, it could never. Yeah. Right. Like, what do you mean? That's impossible. And I think even, questions, I think maybe one of the examples in the book was about binational city or something, right? Mm-hmm. And immediately all kinds of like, but what about this? But what about this is coming to my mind. And it really is about deprogramming what we know to imagine what is possible. And, in some ways, I think that the thing that you think you know and someone else brings a different idea. Yes. To be honest, sometimes my first initial thought is like, wait until you try it. Yeah. That's what blocks the imagination. And I see that. And if I could put that aside for a minute and think big and not get into the weeds about how would we do that? And how could we make that happen? And that could never happen because of X, Y, and Z. I think it opens up the door too.
So here's a question. Yeah. So what are the ramifications? And I believe she does a good job addressing this. She talks about what are the ramifications if we don't?
Right.
Right. What happens, at that point? And one of the things that I thought was interesting, and I'm going to shift the conversation for us a bit to talk about the part where she talks about how we as in society at large and all the technocrats within it, are investing so much into our digital descendants. Not even humans, not even things that exist, right? At the expense of current reality, right? And I thought this was such a profound point that all the things that you just talked about, Laura, we accept these things. We get lulled into a complacency of this is just how things are, and other ideas are not that's just inconvenient or not realistic. And then we invest more, right, into these technology giants in order to think that we're solving a problem now, but we're not. We're investing in them to do whatever, create the metaverse, right? Do anything but solve the problems here. And she talks about how the race to space, right? When we landed on the moon, at the same time, the Harlem Festival was happening. And and I thought about the poem Whitey on the Moon, right? At the same time, too. I was expecting her to bring it up, but I was like, where is Whitey on the Moon? And I thought that was such a poignant kind of parallel to draw with what's happening now and how all this money and technology, our natural resources are being drained into AI data centers and all these things for our digital descent, not even us now, to help us live our lives with sufficiency in any sense. So, I mean, what are the other ramifications?
Yeah, I think that part of the challenge, and she doesn't really address this, and this is not a critique, but imagination and manifesto feels like it's part of a larger thought that she is exercising throughout her other works. And this is just a continuation of that. And maybe because I started reading Viral Justice, I'm trying to see where there are these connections to the point of ramifications. But the one thing that I don't think she addresses, at least not in this book, is the fact that it always is the case that it's not everybody. It's a small number of people. Even the people who are the tech giants is a small number of people. And those who resist and push against it is a small number of people. Yes. And so you wonder, what would it take for people to collectively imagine not using social media? Because there is a reality in which social media never existed. But for those who are in their mid-20s or younger, they don't have that reality. And so just imagine for a second, if 10 million people stopped using Facebook, stopped using Instagram, stopped using X, all at one time, what would that do to the algorithm? Because it is within that algorithm, and I think it was, I don't want to mess up her name. She wrote a book called Searches. I think it's Vauhini, but I might have that wrong. One of the things she said in a conversation this summer that I was fortunate to be a part of was that the reason why search engines and these systems work is because they work, and we use them because they work. And so we begin to rely on them, and they become part of our everyday, and then we slowly but surely can't imagine not being able to use Google to search for things. And the idea of going to a dictionary to look up a word seems so passé. And so to imagine a way of connecting with people who live just in a county over without Facebook or Instagram seems passé now. You know, very few people talk on the phone. They rather text.
I listened to it on an audiobook and I recommend it. It was easy to follow as an audiobook too. So I think we recommend the book. And
Absolutely.
if not the book, Dr. Benjamin has a great TED Talk actually that you can look up, and you can probably find lots of videos of her talks. I've seen her at a conference giving presentation, for example. So please check her out, check out her ideas, and engage, you know, wherever you fall, you know, politically or in terms of imagination. So thanks for joining us. You can find Bookish wherever you get your podcast, and on Facebook we have a page. So if you want to drop us a note about this episode or other episodes, that'd be great. Thanks so much.
Till next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed what you just heard, we have a whole universe of podcasts waiting for you. Simply search Dragon Podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. You can also explore our full lineup and discover new shows at podbean.com/dragonpodcasts. That's podbean.com/dragonpodcasts.